They called him a fool for stopping. They called him stupid for risking his job to carry a madwoman on his back through the scorching heat. But what they don't know, she was not mad, and she was not just an old woman. McKenna had been slumped against the jagged wall of the Sabo market since dawn. To the busy traders and rushing pedestrians, she was invisible, or worse, an eyesore. She just appeared there with the morning sun, old dusty, dressed in a faded wrapper that looked like it had seen better decades, not just better days. She sat right in the mud, not begging for money, not crying out, but laughing at the sky. She wasn't fighting anyone. She wasn't blocking the path. She simply existed, like a pile of discarded trash, ignored by the vibrant chaos of the market. Her headscarf was twisted sideways. Her eyes were bright and manic, pointing excitedly at things only she seemed to see. Her hands were calloused. Her laughter was loud, but her posture was frail, like someone who had walked 1,000 miles just to collapse at people's feet. People passed, some scoffed, some spat on the ground near her. Some even kicked dust in her direction, especially when her laughter grew too loud for their comfort. "Is she drunk?" a young girl asked her friend. "Don't look at her," the friend replied, pulling her away. Bad luck follows madness. The woman selling tomatoes nearby had a different theory. "I heard she is a witch that fell from the sky," she told her customer loud enough for everyone to hear. "The spirits stripped her of her powers, and now she is empty." "Look at her clothes," the customer sneered. "She probably ran away from the asylum. Someone should call the police to sweep her away." Someone else said she was just another beggar pretending to be crazy to get sympathy coins. One taxi driver offered a darker twist. "I believe she is a spy for kidnappers. You know how they use old women to lure children." Nobody knew anything for sure. But for hours, the woman sat in that dirt under the scorching sun, under the insults, under the mockery, and nobody came close enough to ask if she needed water. Nobody except Zubairu. Zubairu was young, strong-willed, and struggling in a way that makes you grow up too fast. He wore a faded yellow polo shirt and trousers that were too short for his ankles, rushing between his classes and his cleaning job. The kind of boy who knew the pain of hunger, but still had the bravery to look people in the eye. The kind of boy whose heart was softer than his rough hands. He had noticed her. At first, he thought she was just resting. Then he saw the crowd gathering not to help, but to jeer. He saw the boys pointing fingers and calling her names. "Stupid," they shouted at the air. "Mad woman." By the time the sun was high, Zubairu was angry. Not at her, but at the cruelty of a world that could watch a grandmother suffer and only offer laughter. He stopped. He turned back. And while the market called him stupid for wasting his time, Zubairu crouched down in the dust and offered her his back. Zubairu wiped the stinging sweat from his eyes, his breath hitching in his chest. His faded yellow polo shirt, already 2 sizes too small, clung to his back like a second skin. If he didn't make it to the construction site in 15 minutes, the foreman would dock his pay again, and his final semester exams would remain an unpaid dream. He tightened his grip on his frayed backpack, head down, legs pumping against the friction of the crowded market, desperate to remain invisible. Then, the laughter stopped him. It wasn't the joyous laughter of a haggling victory, but the sharp, jagged sound of cruelty. He looked up to see a tight circle of people jeering at a heap of colorful rags near the gutter. In the center sat the old woman McKenna, clapping her hands at the sky while dust covered her face. A shopkeeper kicked an empty plastic bottle at her feet, his face twisted in disgust. "Get up, crazy woman. You are scaring away my customers. Go and die somewhere else." Zubairu froze. His feet itched to keep running toward his paycheck, toward his survival. Every logic in his head screamed that this was not his business, that poverty had already given him enough burdens to carry. But his heart remained anchored to the sight of her trembling hands. The crowd was a wall of indifference, a sea of eyes that saw a nuisance rather than a mother. "Look at her," a woman sneered, covering her nose with a silk handkerchief. "She smells like the grave." Leave her alone, Zubairu muttered, stepping into the circle. The shopkeeper turned, eyeing Zubairu's worn shoes and cheap clothes with a sneer. Oh? Is she your mother? Or are you also mad? The crowd erupted in laughter. Look at this boy. He wants to save the witch. Hey, yellow shirt, don't be stupid. She will curse you. Zubairu ignored the heat rising in his cheeks. He knelt beside McKenna. Up close, her eyes weren't just manic. They were terrified, pleading beneath the act. Mama, he whispered, let's get you out of this sun. She giggled, pointing a crooked finger at his chest, her voice high and childish. My chariot? Is it here? Zubairu looked around. There were no taxis, no carts, nothing but the dirt and the mocking faces. He looked at his own shoulders, broad from lifting cement blocks. He was exhausted, but he was her only option. Yes, Mama, Zubairu said, his voice firm despite the jeers raining down on him. He turned his back to her and crouched low in the dust. Your chariot is here. Climb on. She hesitated, then wrapped her thin, frail arms around his neck. As Zubairu grunted and hoisted her onto his back, a man shouted, You are a fool, boy. You think God pays you for carrying trash. Zubairu didn't answer. He hooked his arms under her legs, feeling her bony weight press against his spine. The sweat on his back soaked through instantly, mixing with the dust on her wrapper. He was late. He was likely fired. He was stupid. But as he walked forward, carrying the old woman through the parting sea of mockery, he didn't feel like a fool. He felt like the only human being left in the market. The soles of Zubairu's sneakers scuffed against the asphalt, a rhythmic friction that matched the burning in his lower back. McKenna didn't seem to mind the awkwardness of the piggyback ride. In fact, she treated his sweat-soaked back like a royal sedan chair. She perched high on his shoulders, her wrapper tucked around his waist, pointing a sharp, authoritative finger over his ear toward the horizon, as if she were commanding a fleet of ships rather than a struggling student. Left. Turn left at the junction, boy, she commanded right next to his ear, her voice cracking with delight. The traffic is terrible today on the highway. We must take the scenic route. There was no traffic. The road was empty save for a few stray goats and the shimmering heat waves rising from the tar. Zubairu wiped sweat from his chin with one hand, quickly grabbing her leg again to secure her. His yellow polo shirt was dark with perspiration, sticking uncomfortably to his skin where her chest pressed against his spine. Yes, Mama. We are dodging the traffic, he played along, stepping carefully around a pothole to keep her steady. You are a slow horse, she teased, though her eyes were sharp, scanning his profile with an intensity that didn't match her senile act. What is your name, horse? Zubairu, he huffed, leaning his torso forward to balance her weight as the road began to incline. Zubairu. Strong name. But you look like a worried man, Zubairu. She rested her chin on his dusty shoulder, her breath tickling his neck. Why did you stop for an old witch? Didn't you hear them? They called you stupid. You are losing money carrying this old bag of bones. Zubairu didn't answer immediately. The tremble of exhaustion traveled up his thighs. He thought about the foreman, the shouting that would greet him if he dared return to the site, and the unpaid tuition slip crumbling in his back pocket. My grandmother used to sit like you, he said softly, staring at the dusty road ahead. She died alone in the village because no one stopped to check on her. I couldn't leave you there. McKenna went quiet. The manic energy faded for a brief second as she felt the tension in his trapezius muscles. So, you sacrificed your daily bread for a memory? It's just a shift, Mama, Zubairu lied, though his stomach twisted with anxiety. I can find another site. But if I don't pay my school fees by Friday, I cannot write my final exams. That is the real trouble. He laughed dryly, hoisting her up slightly as she slipped down. But today, at least I am a royal steed. That is a promotion. McKenna hummed, a sound that vibrated against his back with a strange, hidden energy. She straightened up and pointed her finger again, this time with absolute certainty, her arm extending past his face like a compass needle. "Don't worry about the exams, my legs. Just walk. Take the next right. We are going to the green gates." The green gates. Zubairu frowned, slowing his pace. "Mama, that is the estate for the big men. The security there will beat us before we even get close." "March!" she barked, laughing again, pointing imperiously like a general leading a charge. "Trust your captain. The gates will open." Zubairu shook his head, exhausted but smiling faintly at her madness. He stepped firmly, unaware that the old woman clinging to his damp shirt was guiding him not just to a house, but to a destiny he couldn't possibly imagine. The transition from the dusty, potholed market road to the smooth, paved avenue of the wealthy was jarring. Zubairu's sneakers went from crunching on gravel to silent padding on the pristine asphalt, but the quiet only made his ragged breathing sound louder. The weight of the old woman on his back seemed to double with every step, her bony knees digging into his ribs and her thin arms looped tightly around his neck. Ahead stood the gates, monstrous slabs of black iron detailed with gold leaf, flanked by stone lions that looked ready to pounce. It was a fortress, not a home. Zubairu slowed to a halt about 50 feet away, his legs trembling from the exertion. The grandeur of the place made him feel smaller, dirtier, and more out of place than he had ever felt in his life. "Mama," he panted, hitching her higher up his sweat-soaked back to keep her from slipping. "This is it. I can't go closer. If the security sees a boy like me carrying you like a sack of rice, they will break my legs." McKenna didn't loosen her grip. She rested her chin on his damp shoulder, adjusting her dirty headscarf with one hand while staring imperiously at the surveillance cameras blinking red on the high walls. "Don't be a coward, Zubairu," she snapped right into his ear, though he could hear the mischievous smile in her voice. "Finish the job. Park the ride inside." Inside. Zubairu's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you crazy? That is private property. Look at those men." 2 guards had stepped out of the sentry box. They were built like tanks, wearing tactical black uniforms and holding batons. They spotted the strange pair, the sweating student in a tight yellow polo piggybacking a dusty old woman, and began marching toward them with aggressive strides. Zubairu panicked. His survival instinct kicked in. "I have to go," he stammered, trying to kneel to let her down. "Please, Mama, get down. I cannot go to jail." "March." McKenna commanded, her voice vibrating through his spine, cutting through his fear like a blade. It wasn't the voice of a confused grandmother, it was the voice of someone who owned the air she breathed. Frozen between her sudden authority and the approaching guards, Zubairu instinctively obeyed. He forced his aching legs to move forward, bracing himself for the blow. He squeezed his eyes shut as the lead guard reached them, preparing to beg for forgiveness. "Madam," a deep, rumbling voice said. Zubairu opened one eye. The giant guard wasn't reaching for his baton. He was reaching out to gently support McKenna's back to steady her, his face pale with recognition and shock. He snapped to a rigid salute, ignoring the filth on her wrapper against his uniform. "Madam McKenna, we didn't know you were out. Should I call the staff to bring a wheelchair?" McKenna waved him off casually with a hand draped over Zubairu's shoulder. "No need, Musa. My new legs are doing an excellent job." She tapped Zubairu's frozen chest. "Open the gate, Musa. My guest is thirsty." The massive golden gates groaned open, revealing a driveway lined with imported palms and luxury cars that shone like jewels. Zubairu stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open as he looked from the billionaire estate to the dirty old woman clinging to his back. "Well." McKenna chuckled, tightening her hold. "Close your mouth, Zubairu, and walk. You don't drop a lady in the driveway." The sprint back to the construction site felt less like running and more like a death march. Zubairu's legs, already trembling from the miles he had walked with the extra weight on his back, threatened to buckle with every step. His yellow polo was soaked through, sticking to his skin like a wet rag. He was 2 hours late. He skidded into the dusty lot, gasping for air, but the familiar cacophony of cement mixers and shouting men seemed distant. The silence that fell when the foreman saw him, however, was deafening. "Oga, please," Zubairu wheezed, doubling over, clutching his knees. "I had an emergency. A woman. She couldn't walk. I had to carry her." The foreman, a bull of a man with eyes that had seen every excuse in the city, didn't even look up from his clipboard. "An emergency," he repeated flatly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled wad of Naira notes, and threw them into the dirt at Zubairu's feet. "Take your half-day pay and go. Don't come back." "Sir, please," Zubairu pleaded, ignoring the shame burning his ears as he looked at the dusty money. "My exams are next week. I need this job. I promise." "You promised to be here at 7, the foreman roared, finally snapping his head up. "You think this building waits for you? You think I care about your charity work? Go and let the old woman pay your school fees." Zubairu stood frozen as the other workers averted their eyes. He slowly bent down, picked up the notes, and walked away. The money wasn't even enough to cover his transport for the week, let alone his tuition. The boys at the market were right, he thought bitterly. He was stupid. He had traded his degree, his escape plan from poverty, for a thank you from a stranger. The walk home was a blur of defeat. He trudged through the narrow, garbage-strewn alleyways of his neighborhood, the physical pain in his spine masking the hollow ache in his chest. He imagined the dean's face when he would have to explain why he couldn't write the final paper. It was over. As he turned the corner toward his compound, a cluster of rusted zinc shacks leaning against each other, he stopped. The air felt different. His neighbors, usually loud and busy, were standing in hushed clusters, staring at his front door. Parked directly in front of his shack, looking like a spaceship that had crash-landed in a landfill, was a gleaming black SUV. It was spotless, its engine purring with a low, expensive hum that vibrated against the tin walls. Leaning against the hood was a man in a crisp uniform, checking a gold wristwatch. Zubairu hesitated, wondering if the police had come for him. The man looked up, locking eyes with him. It wasn't the guard from the gate. This man was sleeker, sharper. "Zubairu?" the man asked, his voice smooth and professional. "Yes." Zubairu whispered, clutching his backpack strap. The man opened the rear passenger door. "I am Kamisi. Madam McKenna is asking for you. She says you left before she could discuss your salary." The air conditioning inside the mansion hit Zubairu like a physical blow, instantly chilling the sweat on his skin. The foyer was a cavern of white marble and crystal, silent as a cathedral and smelling faintly of lavender and old money. He stood near the door, afraid to move his scuffed sneakers for fear of leaving a mark on the pristine floor that looked more like frozen milk than stone. "So this is the stray cat Auntie dragged in from the gutter." The voice was smooth, slick like oil on glass. Zubairu turned to see a man descending the spiral staircase with practiced elegance. Seko wore a tailored navy suit that fit him like armor, his gold cufflinks catching the light. Beside him stood a woman, Tawanga, scrolling through a tablet with bored detachment. She glanced at Zubairu for a second, wrinkled her nose as if she smelled rotting fish, and went back to her screen. "I am Zubairu," he said, trying to square his shoulders, though he felt shrinking under their gaze. "I didn't ask," Seko sneered, stopping on the bottom step. He didn't come closer, he stayed at a distance, as if poverty were contagious. "Tawanga, check if the cleaners are still on shift. The foyer needs to be sanitized. It smells of desperation." "Noted," Tawanga droned, not looking up. "Should I call security to remove the debris?" Zubairu clenched his fists, his fingernails digging into his palms. The foreman's shouting had been angry, but this casual, quiet dehumanization, cut deeper. He turned to the door, ready to walk back to the slums rather than endure another second of this, but the double doors at the end of the hall swung open with a crash. "Leave him alone, Seko." McKenna stood in the doorway. She was no longer the dusty figure from the market. She wore a flowing emerald caftan and leaned on a cane with a silver lion's head handle, looking every inch the matriarch. Seko's face shifted instantly into a mask of sickening sweetness. "Auntie, we were just concerned about security. You know you can't just let strangers wander the halls. Your condition." "My condition is fine," she snapped, her voice sharp. "My judgment is better. Get out of my sight. Both of you." Seko's smile didn't waver, but his eyes drilled into Zubairu, a look of pure, cold venom, before he took Tawanga's arm and retreated. Once they were gone, McKenna beckoned Zubairu into a massive library lined with mahogany shelves. She closed the heavy doors, shutting out the cold atmosphere of the house. "You see them?" she asked softly, dropping the commanding tone. She looked tired now. "They are waiting for me to die. They smile, they nod, but they are counting the minutes until they can sell this house and burn my legacy." "Why bring me here, Ma?" Zubairu asked, his voice trembling. "I don't belong here." "That is exactly why I need you," McKenna said, pouring him a glass of water with her own hands. "I have enough experts. I have enough snakes. I need a human being." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I want to hire you, Zubairu. Not as a servant. I need you to be my eyes and ears. I need you to watch them when I cannot. Help me see who they really are." The following evening, the mansion was quiet, a heavy silence that felt more suffocating than the noise of the construction site. Zubairu was sweeping the petals from the poolside patio when a shadow fell over his work. He looked up to find Seko watching him, not with a sneer this time, but with a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You work hard," Seko said, stepping closer, the scent of expensive cologne overpowering the smell of chlorine. "It's a waste, really. A boy with your potential, sweeping leaves for a dying woman." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, cream-colored envelope. "I did some digging, Zubairu. Final year student, civil engineering. Outstanding debts. It's a shame when poverty kills a bright future." Zubairu tightened his grip on the broom handle. "I am managing, sir." "But you don't have to simply manage." Seko extended the envelope. "Open it." Zubairu hesitated, then took it. Inside was a check. The number made his breath hitch. It was more money than he would make in 2 years of hard labor. It was his tuition, his rent, and enough to send money back to the village. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was freedom. "That is for you," Seko purred, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A scholarship, let's call it. From the family." He produced a sleek leather folder and clicked open a pen. "All you have to do is sign this. It's a simple medical affidavit. It states that when you found Auntie at the market, she was hallucinating, violent, and unable to recognize her surroundings. It confirms she is senile and needs professional institutional care." The paper sat on the patio table, waiting. A signature for a future. A lie for a life. Zubairu looked at the check, the ink glistening under the garden lights. He thought of the foreman throwing crumbs at his feet. He thought of the humiliation. Then, he thought of McKenna's clear eyes in the library, the way she had trusted him when his own world had called him stupid. She wasn't senile. She was surrounded by wolves. "She wasn't hallucinating," Zubairu said quietly. Seko's smile hardened at the edges. "Don't be an idiot. Take the money. If she stays in charge, she will ruin this empire. We are saving her from herself." "You are saving your inheritance," Zubairu corrected. He looked Seko in the eye, crumpled the check in his fist, and tore it down the middle. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet garden. He let the pieces fall onto the wet concrete. I am not for sale. Seko stared at the torn paper, his face draining of all fake warmth. He stepped in close, invading Zubairu's space, his voice a low hiss. You think you are noble? You are just a pauper playing a game you don't understand. You will regret this, boy. By tomorrow, you will wish you had stayed in the gutter. Seko didn't storm off after the boy tore the check. He stood in the garden for a long moment, smoothing the lapels of his suit, his face settling into a mask of terrifying calm. If the rat wouldn't take the cheese, it was time to unleash the trap. He turned on his heel and walked straight to the service corridor, where the shadows were deep and the staff tried to make themselves invisible. He found Nalathando folding towels in the laundry room. She froze as he entered, her eyes widening in fear. She was young, a single mother who sent every naira home, and Seko knew it. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet pouch. I have a job for you, he said, placing the pouch on the folding table. Sir, she whispered, backing away. Zubairu's bag is in the cloakroom, Seko said, his voice devoid of emotion. You are going to put this inside the main pocket, deep at the bottom. Nalathando shook her head, tears instantly springing to her eyes. Please, sir. He is a good boy. I cannot. You can and you will, Seko interrupted, stepping closer. Unless you want the police to find this in your bag instead? Theft is a serious crime, Nalathando. You would go to prison for years. Who would feed your daughter then? The maid let out a choked sob, her hands trembling as she reached for the pouch. It felt heavy with sin. Seko watched her leave, satisfied. Fear was a much cheaper currency than bribery. Nalathando moved through the house like a ghost, her heart thundering against her ribs. She slipped into the cloakroom where Zubairu had left his frayed backpack, the one with the broken zipper. She looked over her shoulder, praying no one would see, praying God would forgive her. Her fingers fumbled with the bag. Inside, she saw notebooks, a water bottle, and a small wrapped sandwich. It was the bag of a struggler, a survivor. With a whimper of guilt, she shoved the velvet pouch beneath the notebooks, burying the diamonds under his poverty. She zipped the bag shut, trapping Zubairu's fate inside. The trap was set, and the boy who had refused to be bought was now going to pay a price far higher than money. The grand hall shimmered with the light of 1,000 crystals, filled with guests who smelled of expensive perfume and deceit. It was McKenna's birthday, and the entire family had gathered, not to celebrate her life, but to hover over her estate. Zubairu stood near the service entrance, clutching his backpack, feeling the familiar itch of being an intruder in a world that didn't want him. Suddenly, Seko stepped onto the small stage, cutting the music with a sharp tap on his microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the interruption, he announced, his face a mask of practiced concern. But a tragedy has occurred. Auntie McKenna's vintage diamond collier has vanished from her dressing room. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Seko's eyes scanned the room and locked onto Zubairu. We have strict security, of course. But we have recently allowed unvetted elements into our sanctuary. He pointed a manicured finger at Zubairu. Search the boy. No. Zubairu stepped back as 2 police officers materialized from the shadows. I haven't touched anything. You can't. Seko didn't wait. He strode forward, snatched the frayed backpack from Zubairu's grip, and appended it onto the pristine floor. Notebooks, a water bottle, and a wrapped sandwich tumbled out. And then, with a heavy thud, the velvet pouch hit the marble. The room fell dead silent. Seko bent down, opened the pouch, and pulled out the glittering necklace. A thief, he spat, shaking his head. I knew you were garbage. The officer slammed Zubairu against the wall, twisting his arms behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. I didn't take it. Zubairu screamed, looking desperately at McKenna, who sat slumped in her wheelchair. Mama, please. I swear. Seko smirked, leaning in close to Zubairu's ear. "I told you, boy. You should have taken the check." He waved at the police. "Get him out of here." "Stop." The word wasn't a whisper. It was a command that cracked the air like a whip. McKenna stood up from her wheelchair. She didn't tremble. She didn't lean on her cane. She stood tall, her spine straight, her eyes blazing with a terrifying clarity. The room froze. "Auntie." Seko faltered, stepping back. "Sit down, you're confused." "I am not confused, Seko," she said, her voice echoing off the walls. "I am disappointed." She pulled a small remote from her sleeve and pointed it at the massive projection screen behind the stage. "I told Zubairu I needed eyes. I didn't tell you I had them everywhere." The screen flickered to life. The grain was gritty, but the image was unmistakable. Nalathando, weeping in the laundry room, shoving the velvet pouch into Zubairu's bag. The silence in the hall turned suffocating. Seko's face drained of color. McKenna walked slowly toward him, looking like a queen preparing to execute a traitor. "Release my son," she ordered the police, "and arrest the real thief." The silence that followed McKenna's revelation was broken only by the sound of handcuffs clicking, this time around Seko's wrists. The man who had worn his arrogance like a suit of armor now looked small, his face crumbling as the officers marched him past the guests he had tried so hard to impress. He didn't look at McKenna. He stared at the floor, unable to face the ant he had underestimated or the boy he had failed to destroy. As the heavy doors slammed shut behind him, the tension in the room broke. McKenna turned to Zubairu, who was rubbing his wrists, still in shock. She reached out, her hand steady and warm, and cupped his face. "They called you stupid for helping me, Zubairu," she said, her voice projecting to every corner of the silent hall. "They laughed because you carried a dirty madwoman on your back like a sack of rice. They saw a boy soiling his only good shirt with my dust and sweat. But on those tired shoulders, you carried the only thing this family lacked, integrity." She signaled to her lawyer, who stepped forward with a file. "Your tuition is paid in full, Zubairu. You will finish your degree. But you will not return to the construction site." She took the file and placed it in his hands. "These are adoption papers. I never had a child of my own, but I know a son when I see one. Tonight, you stop being the boy from the market. You are now the future of this empire." Tears blurred Zubairu's vision as the room erupted into applause, genuine this time. He looked at the woman who had changed his life, not with magic, but with a test of character he hadn't known he was taking. 6 months later, the struggle of that hot afternoon seemed like a distant memory. The morning sun was gentle on the estate grounds as Zubairu pushed McKenna's wheelchair along the garden path. He walked with a new confidence, his degree certificate hanging in his office. "So, Mr. CEO," McKenna said, leaning back and pointing a finger at a plot of land on the blueprints resting on her lap. "The new scholarship fund for working students. You want to build the center near the market." "Right where you found me, Mama," Zubairu smiled, steering her toward the blooming hibiscus flowers. He looked down at her frail frame, remembering the surprising weight of her bony knees digging into his sides that day. "It's easier pushing this chair than carrying you, you know." McKenna laughed, the sound bright and full of life. "You had the strength for it then, my son. You bore the weight when no one else would." Zubairu pushed forward, no longer a boy crushed by the weight of the world, but a man supporting a legacy. They called him a fool for carrying her, but they didn't know he was carrying his destiny.